Hi there. This is Aldo Lauria Santiago. I will be presenting an additional portion of the presentation on workflow ideas for historians. Structure refers to these elements: naming files, naming things, could be files, could be other things. The structure of the folders, in other words, the structure of the named things, the very naming of those structures. Any additional metadata that you use um, to embed within those files or structures, again, for later searching. And parallel or integrated is just a reference that I'll show to how you organize files, file structure. And there is a logic of gathering, but then there's a logic of searching. And sometimes they're at odds with each other. So this question of parallel or integrated file structures is important. And then files that you create as you're writing and how you structure those. So I'll cover these things in a video. It should take about 20 to 30 minutes. I'll show you how I do it, but mostly to give you ideas about how you might want to do it yourself. For me, the starting point of any project has to do with the file structure. And typically, I organize my projects based on the product that I expect to have, which is usually books based on a particular set of research experiences, research work, right? So, for example, Research New York City is one of my major organizing principles, right? And, it took me a while to clarify what belongs. And this is basically driven by the coherence of the sources themselves. In other words, under New York City, I have two books and articles and other products that relate to the project, mostly because they were researched together. So there's a lot of things in there that are not strictly speaking about New York City, but they are reflective of a research experience, which was coherent, right? And you can see here that I have research Puerto Rico, right? And these are folders that you can put in your root structure. In other words, under documents. I have a lot of stuff in here, but basically I have these research folders, right? And the reason why I name them all research is so that they are lumped together in one same space in my folder structure, so I can find them quickly, right? But as I showed in the previous video, I use tabbed file managers. So this tabbed file manager, which is QTT-bar, that overlays on top of a file manager that comes with Windows, allows me to automatically open these tabs. So I have them all saved in its system. Every time I open File Manager, it opens a set of folders of any in any place. It just opens them next to each other, right? So I can tab back and forth. And these are other projects that I could easily close, right? So, oops, sorry, I closed the Research New York, so now I have to find it again and restructure it. Let me get rid of these other ones and make it a little simpler. So I'm showing you this through the file manager, even though I could use the tools, the more sophisticated file management tools that I introduced in the previous video. just to keep it simple, right? But the implication sometimes of the things that I am covering now um, are sometimes more visible when you use the software, right? Okay, so it's taken me a while to develop this kind of simple structure. And in one folder, I have everything that's a source. In another folder, I have new sources and that's a very subjective definition of, since I did most of the reading for this project, I've added new materials, right? So that's a way for me to distinguish kind of a time frame. And then files that have to do with planning of the project, especially when it was a hustling project where you had to go to different places and complete different things physically, traveling, etc. And then research notes I keep separately. And those research notes are everything but the notes from books and articles. In other words, anything that is not a publication goes in here. My notes from books and publications go into my EndNote data, which is the bibliographic manager. Right? So that's one decision that I made, that I didn't want to keep Word files as notes for things that would be that are part of a book or an article. And there's some in between things where I had to make some choices. For example, periodicals. I've done both. I kept when I read a series of newspapers for one title, I go through 20, 30 issues of that same title. Sometimes I take the notes in EndNote, and sometimes I take the notes into a Word file. And it makes them searchable in different ways, right? And actually, some of them I have in both. I started in one and then I copied it into a different format, right? And then research resources are guides and other resources that have more to do with the process of finding things. And then writing is where I keep my manuscripts, right? So for me, the biggest distinction is this archival initially, right? In the beginning of the project, there's no writing. It's just, actually, the first section in writing are abstracts and proposals, including funding proposals. But the big one and the critical one is this section of research, right? And the big categories here are archives and published material, because for me, in my mind, that makes it retrievable for different purposes, and therefore I want to keep them separate. Then I have sections that have to do with audio and photos, and then I've separated memoirs, and then music and sound. Actually, that's where the audio goes, and then oral histories, which I have collected. I have not collected them myself. I have researched them and found them at different locations. Some of them are full transcripts, some of them are notes. And then periodicals is similar to the archives in the sense that it has a lot of original material in there. I'll show you. And quantitative data, which is census, surveys, statistics, I try to separate those out, in part because often the quantitative data, you start with a complex search that implies looking at lots of different censuses and so forth just to get one little table. So I want to keep that separate. And also because I constantly keep going back with different or new questions to that data. And then research assistant work is anything that comes through a research assistant, and usually it goes through that folder and then gets sorted out to its proper place. And then a subcomponent of Spaniards in New York City, which for some reason I separated it out from the actual sources, um, violating my own rules there. But okay, let's see what's in these, right? So, and the important thing here is that I try to follow this structure for different projects, right? So that whenever I open a project, it's going to look a little bit like this, right? Or mostly like this, right? So archives is really, really important to know where these images came from. I organize them by location, by place of origin. And these have to be named very carefully. Uh, and sometimes I keep a reference to when the research was done, right? And depending on how long it took, also the date for, many of these are just 1 day of work or 2 days of work, so that's not complicated. But sometimes it's months of work in one same collection. So these are digital items which are best looked at through the other software that I've explained already, right? So you can see here that these are um, documents that I gathered in this particular, the AFL-CIO archive, right? Um, and the Archivo General de Puerto Rico is this. The American Labor Party at Rutgers is a collection. So sometimes these are archives with distinct sub-collections. Sometimes they are just a simple collection in one physical location, right? Um, and some are small, some are humongous. So, for example, Centro, which is the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, I've examined many collections there, and I kept folders for each day of work, which I've considered merging, but I'm not sure about that one. And basically, I'm already done with most of the work, so I had thought of streamlining it, but the problem is that many of these folders are actually pretty big. So, but the point is that I can identify quickly which collection, within which collection a document might be, based on at least the naming, if not naming plus date. Um, and of course, within these, I have materials which are best used through the software, right? And for some reason, this is taking a while to show me. There it is. So these are the materials that I scanned for one particular folder. Now, one of the critical pieces here, and I'll go back to the archival section, is that any work, there's a section in the slides where this is raised later, so I can explain it better later. But this work is accompanied by certain files that I create as I'm working. And for each one of these archives, there is a log that I keep as I go along. And also, it matches a plan file where all my archives are listed. So as I learn things, I change them as I go along. In the plan, I clarify certain pieces, and in the log, I get into the details of what boxes I requested and what boxes I looked at or I couldn't find or had to postpone, or where I started and where I finished, and notes to self, and also notes that for items that might be important to other people. So you can see here that I have a bunch of miscellaneous things which I've added out of order, and basically my assumption is that anything that's down here, I have to sort out later, or is not terribly important, right? So the other important part here, let me, books and articles is predictable. Authors, anything that I've had scanned into PDF or downloaded that is published is here, right? And usually these items are also reproduced within EndNote. In other words, the EndNote item for any one of these books also has the PDFs, so I can see them there. So there's a little bit of duplication, not a little bit, the intent is to duplicate everything. So, for example, Abrams, How to Remedy Our Puerto Rican Problem has an entry in EndNote, and a copy of that PDF is in EndNote, within EndNote as well. And EndNote keeps it separately. And also notice that I've taken the time to rename everything with author, or at least the last name, title, and year, plus any other element, like if it's a dissertation, that kind of thing. And by the way, I've tried to run the OCR, the character recognition, in all these PDFs, regardless of where they come from, so that they are searchable internally. And then the other big section here are the notes, right? The other big section here are the research notes. And here, there's a few practices that I've developed that I repeat. I try to separate out notes by kind of source. And the most important one here are archival notes. The notes from books and articles, those are the ones that are reproduced within EndNote. Notes from newspapers means that I read, 20, 30 issues of a paper and entered a file. And then notes from oral histories and so forth, and some miscellaneous things. And the notes more or less reproduces the archival structure, right? That I have where the sources are. But in some cases, one collection of materials produces two sections, one that is notes and one that is like a log, right? The AFL-CIO notes are in one file in this case because it was the right scale, right? But in other cases, the collections are more complicated and the notes are in different files. But notice that everything that is a note has the word notes in the title. And that's really important for searching later, for restricting my searches, right? So that files that are content, files that are notes to myself, like log, files that are just miscellaneous. There's always a lot of that stuff, but the ones that are just my notes, based on whatever I read, always have the word notes in there, and I try to put it in caps. That I have to fix. So sometimes I commit things like this. The Centro has various collections, and I keep notes for each collection. However, if you notice this file, I committed the foolishness of, because it was one collection, I kept it all in one file. and this file is like 500 pages long. And I've really been tempted to cut it up into parts, but it's too late for that. And I should have structured it correctly so that it reflected some sort of per box structure. So I would break down these notes instead of one enormous file. I would have separate boxes, separate files for each box, right? You can see here. And notice within this file is probably, it's saying 13 pages, but it'll sort itself out. It's probably a few hundred pages. So this is a long file for notes for one collection that should have been broken down into separate ones. And notice also that I use headers, actual headers, for these titles, so that when I do headings list, in this case, they're all here. And I can go quickly to any particular header, which is a box number, right? And these are characteristics of Word, a word that you can use. And also notice that I have tagged all years in yellow, so they're more visible, right? This, and this, right? The headers. And there's, you can learn how to do that in Word. And now my file is reading 630 pages, right? Okay, so let's close this file. Oh, by the way, when I was entering the data, when I was awake, I'd enter data, read documents and enter notes. And usually what I had was the software that I use for file management, Paperport or File Center, open on one screen, and in the other screen I am taking notes, right? So one panel shows me the documents and the other panel shows me the file. And sometimes I'm using drag and dictate just to dictate notes. I'll explain that piece of software in a different segment. So back to the file structure. You can see that there's certain things called logs and lists, right? And also some miscellaneous things that maybe I never sorted out correctly. But basically the important part is that the files named notes are all searchable. And the reason I really want to make that useful is when I go into my Copernic software, which I showed you in the first segment, and I go to my New York project, right? So right now, Copernic allows me, as a good indexing software would, to search only my New York City files, right? So I'm working with New York right now. And then I'm going to search for files. I'm not going to search, I am delimiting to notes, right? Now that I have delimited to notes, I will search for anything in particular, a Boolean search of Jesus, Bon, and Pedro. So let's just Jesus and Pedro, right? So in these notes, I know that Jesus and Pedro, within each one of these notes, Jesus and Pedro will appear. Now, the negative of having that really long file of notes in Opus. See this one here? The 600 pages, is that almost every searchable term shows up. Since the post-war period. From 1947 on, almost every searchable word shows up. And therefore, it's kind of useless to find a search term in here. Because if it were broken down into sections more appropriately, I'd be able to do a more refined search. So Jesus and Pedro are in the file, but Jesus is probably in some context way at the beginning of my notes, and Pedro is unrelated to that Jesus entry in way another section of the 600 pages, right? Now, of course, Copernic gives me additional tools, but that's, I covered that in the initial video, right? So this is the same note file that I had just showed you, but it's been selected through a process of search here. I can add additional limiters, and then I can search within the file as well. And obviously, I can cut and paste and so forth. So that's Copernic. Back to the file structure. That's why notes plus the proper name plus the proper file structure are important, right? Let's pause there. So you can see why the naming is so important. It's for later retrieval when you just simply have too much to remember, right? There has to be a logic to either the material itself or the way that you received it, or also the way in which you process it that has to make sense to you. And that's where the parallel or integrated, I've experimented with integrating, but I always end up separating. And that means that my notes are separate from the sources, basically. That's it. And then the third piece is the writing part, right? Sometimes the process is messy, but I end up having pieces of one and another, but in order to really complete a project and know where things are at, I have to end up resorting, and so I end up with structures that are parallel in the sense that the materials themselves are separate from how I'm going to use them, in part because sometimes I don't know how I'm going to use them. And I used to have a chapter and its own sources until I realized that chapter structures fall apart. And sources are useful in ways that are unpredictable. So now it's sources separate, notes separate, and writing separate. And then these in-between documents are more flexible. The logs, the notes to yourself, the plans, right? And the plan piece sometimes is forgotten. But and it has a lot of miscellaneous, but there's a certain logic to things that I need to do. So you see the search and do items for newspapers, and search and do items that have more to do with a secondary piece, which is themes relating to Puerto Rico itself, not New York City. And whatever, but I have this document called Research Sites and Task Outline, right? And every so often I revisit it. It's a constant work with that document to clarify sections, subsections, and what I did and what I have not done yet. Here. And this starts very simple and then ends up being very complicated, especially as you try to separate out the parts that you have done and the parts that you have not done and the parts that you will never do. I seem to have embedded an image here. I have no idea what that is. So every archive, every section of an archive, there's phone numbers, typically addresses, hours, and even notes about who I talked to will end up here, right? National Archives, right? And usually I try to keep these things up to date as to what sections I've seen, right? And so each one of these is a kind of to-do list broken down into certain questions like this. The notes and to-do, the quantitative notes, this one, comes from actually reading documents and writing chapters and asking myself, wait, I need to find out something or other. And it might not even go in the text that I'm looking at, but it has to be solved so I can then figure out, how to bring it in. So you have to create these intermediary files that are live, so to speak. They're constantly changing. You're constantly adding and removing. And then, of course, later they're all searchable. So if you lose track of something, they're easily searchable. You know what folder they're in, and you can do a search that is restricted to those folders. And then there's two additional things that I want to cover. One is metadata. And metadata, there's two ways of doing it. Both of them are useful. Any description that you enter in a file functions as metadata because it's searchable, right? And for example, in some files, I've entered a triple star. And I use a triple star. I'm sorry, it's not in this. It's in the file, it's the hashtag, the numbers sign, right? And that means to indicate that it has particular value to me. Sometimes instead of the hashtag, I put some word of now, or soon, right? But I make it searchable. I tag it, the file, and make it searchable. So wherever it is, when I do a search for those items, they show up. In my files, I use the triple star in the text file. *** means that some note that I took is going to be really important to me later. And I'm not sure where and when, but I want to tag it as a juicy kind of section, right? So the other way of doing metadata functions through the software. So this is Paperport, and this is the AFL-CIO archive materials, right? You can see it here. Same structure that I showed you earlier. Basically, this all-in-one search thing is what allows you to tag certain documents and then search for them. You can search within the text if it has that characteristic, or if you have tagged these files with a specific name. Paperport allows you to have its own search function here, the all-in-one search for whatever text might or might not appear in the files. And it could be in the file itself, or in the name, the naming structure. It could also be, so for example, if these were PDFs and they were searchable PDFs, then the index function would work on them. And if you go to properties for any Windows file, you can add file properties, which is an additional level of tags. In the case of photos, you can add these things that it thinks are related to photos, but you can add any field here where you can just use general notes. And then that becomes searchable. There's a tool for entering keywords to those characteristics of all these files. So you can select them all and add a tag. And depending on the scale of the material that you have, partially I don't need to do that careful tagging because I have already done careful folder structuring and also keeping track of things. Now you'll notice that I have a numerical system that comes from my camera. In a more careful work of preparation, I would have changed this designation to something that actually makes more sense, that is related to the file structure. So, these are letters of, 5 pages of letters from somebody to somebody. I would rename it with that. And box number 5, letter, whatever. That's more careful work. My equivalent to that is that in my notes, I carefully note when I feel I need to, the image number of an item, so I can then go back and find it within a folder. And because these are ordered sequentially, the benefit of the numbering is that they follow the numbering sequence. It's like a film of what you did in sequence in a given archive. So your notes tend to follow that, right? And that's how my notes on this folder follow this sequence, right? And that's how it makes sense to me. But if I were to be more careful, I would have renamed these numbers to something that is searchable and that makes sense in relation to the content or the box, the origin, right? I've done that in some sections, but I didn't discover that could be useful until I had done a lot of the document reading. So it's a choice you have to make, but do it early so that you practice it consistently. I've been emphasizing how naming conventions matter. And in the New York City project, I mentioned how we can rename files and make them searchable in a way that a more restricted search for my files as opposed to content. In other words, I am searching, there's a moment when you're searching for the things that you have organized in the way that you have organized them. And that presumably incorporates something about the content, but you're not in that moment searching content. You're searching that intermediate level of organizing or filtering or tagging or naming that you've done already as a shortcut. And that's the whole point of this explanation, right? So the best example I have in New York City are the notes files, right? Which I've tagged as notes, but I have other examples that I mentioned, like entering hashtag to demarcate something that I need to look at, entering a specific word in the title of a file, and also entering the triple star in my notes so that I can find it later. So you're free to do things the way you want it, right? Based on your needs, but think in an open-ended way about how naming things will help you later, right? That's the critical piece. It's not just that it makes sense then, but also what it will be like in a different context where you're not staring at your file, your neat file structure. You've sort of reviewed it all. No, you're not reviewing anything. You're doing something else. And then you need to find things. So, and I'll give you an example of how naming can be used. I'm going to go to the archive section. So I am here. New York City, archival work and documents, and then archives, specific archives. And this collection, the American Labor Party, held at Rutgers, right? And in this case, because the collection was relatively small, and because of the kind of item that I found, I chose to rename each file with the actual box number and description, so that if I were to do a search for ALP, box number, whatever, in the name of the files, right, which is a kind of searching that I can do, not in the content, right? So I can do this, right? So I could give you other examples, but you get the idea, right? That naming files matters. But I want to show two file renaming utilities. One comes for free with Windows, called PowerToys. And PowerToys has Power Rename. And Power Rename is a renaming utility, right? Very straightforward. Now, there's a more powerful utility that is used for renaming, and it's called Bulk Rename Utility. And this allows you to Bulk Rename Utility. This allows you to take a folder or the contents of multiple folders and do anything you want to them, including bulk renaming as a series, today number 1, today number 2, today number 3. You can add prefix, suffix to the existing name, so you can actually take a number. Let's say that if it's a number generated by a camera or a date generated by a camera, then you can add a suffix or a prefix that maybe refers to the kind of material or the collection, ALP, right, as a prefix. This is very powerful. It looks really complicated, but it isn't. You just have to kind of check the manual. There's videos on YouTube for how to use all of these tools. And this can be case sensitive, it can be numerical, etc., right? And that allows you to go into one of these folders, let's say, where you have something less useful. Let me see this, for example, and rename them in a way that reflects your ordering, your whatever, right? And let's go to writing, which is another one of the major folders, right? And these are different projects, and as work develops, these folders get reorganized. But basically, the two books that I've been working on have their own folder, right? And eventually appeared as book 1 and book 2 with a folder for papers that became chapters that then got sorted out into book 1 and book 2, an ongoing outline, applications for fellowships or for money or paper conference kind of proposals, and then backups to the backups. I have many backups. So so book 1 is organized by chapter, additional backups, conclusion, preface, correspondence with publisher for this particular volume, and then I have the thing called shortcuts, and the master file, which means a integrated version of the book itself, of the manuscript. So here, these shortcuts, this is a thing that Windows has. It's not the file itself. It's a shortcut to the file itself. So if I really wanted to just really quickly open these chapters, I have a shortcut for each one of them. And if I mess around with the targets of the shortcuts, then it's not going to work, right? And then I also have specific items that I want to look at that I haven't read. This is sort of like a to-do list. Items that I have in my file folders, document folders, that I really want to look at. Like I keep not getting it done, right? So so I add a shortcut to that document within this folder, right? And basically it's stuff that I found after I've written, the book. That's typical. And that I just haven't integrated or discussed or debated or whatever, and might never do, right? Because it's just never ending. So within chapters, the idea here is obviously to have the chapter itself, but I sometimes have versions of the chapter with comments from people, and a notes and to-do file for each chapter, which is where I quickly write things that need to be done. And then sometimes I have demographic tables that I've either drawn from, so I put a copy, or that will be integrated into the text. And then other miscellaneous cuts that eventually don't make any sense to me anymore. But it's really important to have a system in which you can track the biography of everything, right? Old versions, new versions, named versions, pieces that are coming in, pieces that are coming out. And eventually these things will become like this, just one particular chapter. That's it. So that ends this presentation on structure, and the next video will cover designing your own guides, which I've suggested here. But I will give a closer look in the next video.